Okay, so it's been a little while since I actually made anything, and the reason for that is my PC broke rather unceremoniously in the sense that Windows decided it didn't want to work after an update, so I lost basically everything other than what was in my documents. So I have had to reacquire some editing software before I was able to make anything, but fortunately I have done that. If anything, the editing software I've got now is better than the one that I had, so I might be able to upload in slightly higher quality now, which is a good thing overall. So maybe me losing all my files and having to reinstall everything turned out to be a good thing in the end, because it inspired me to actually do something about my less than stellar editing software. But I decided I would make, the first video that I would make on the return of my PC would be the top 10 mid-tier infantry or line infantry, the sort of the bread and butter of your armies, if you will. And I had this in progress before my PC broke down, so I had a place to start from at least, and this one was difficult, honestly, of all the top 10s, mainly because it wasn't a matter of just taking a single unit. I now had to take into account cost more than ever, and also the importance of the unit to the faction as a whole, how good they are, how many you can have before the cost increases, is a pretty important factor when you come to units which are meant to be used in bulk, as opposed to the super high tier units, which you're only going to really have one of in the vast majority of cases. So this is going to be interesting. There's going to be a great deal of personal opinion in here, but still, I mean, I'm not entirely, like, the criteria that I used was basically, can you build an army around it? You know, because mid-tier can mean a number of things based on the faction you are. Orcs obviously are going to have different middle-tier quality units to elves, for example, but you can't build an army around the Mithlon nobles, which are a sort of mid-tier elven infantry, so I didn't include them. Whereas the Sword Quindi is a unit you can build an army around, which is why I did decide to include them in the testing for this, despite the fact they are technically the worst elven infantry unit. They didn't make it onto the list, obviously. They are technically an honourable mention because they do some things very well. But even so, we should get going. Before we do start, though, there are a few units that I will give honourable mentions now. One of which is the Orc Marauders from Gundabad, because while they are individually pretty garbage, they still have the good versus armour trait, which for a unit as cheap as they are, and as fodder-like as they are, this does mean that it gives Gundabad a bit of extra edge against a faction which is over-reliant on its armour maybe, like Gondor or the Dwarves. The opposite end of the Orc spectrum would be the Heavy Goblin Infantry, which didn't make the list either, but it does also, it costs the same, but instead of having good versus armour, it has excellent armour itself, so it does manage to stand up to skirmish fire a little more. Misty Mountains are pretty good at nullifying skirmishers when all is said and done, to be honest with you, but they won't do very well in melee. They're still goblins after all. But we'll start off, and I would be interested in the feedback for this one, to be honest with you, because I did ultimately make this list in a bit of a vacuum while my PC was broken, and, well, partly while my PC was broken and partly during the testing that I've done in the past couple of days. So I would be interested to see what you all have to say about this, because some units you may argue shouldn't be on the list at all, because there is an elven unit on this list, and you may argue that the elves don't really have a place in a list that's mainly about sort of more basic units. But we'll see, we'll see. We'll start off with number 10. Now, I did mention in a video that I did on the Dead Marshes that I do still admire Harad's Dismounted Serpent Guard because of how important they are to Harad as a faction and how potentially cost efficient they are. And this is what gets them onto the list. I did honestly kind of expect them to go a little bit higher. Maybe not up to the highest reaches, but honestly, as a sword and shield unit, their stats are as follows. Let me just find my notes. We have 19 attack, 34 defense, and 15 charge. They can form shield wall. They have excellent morale, good stamina and armor. Now, importantly, it is worth mentioning that unit scaling will come into this a little bit more than on any other list, mainly because it does make a difference. On huge scaling, for example, the numbers advantage that the Orcs possess becomes even more keenly felt, and the Elven and Dwarven deficit comes into it a little bit more. But when the unit scaling is on large, they have 153 men in the unit under normal circumstances without the general. They cost 700 florins each, and you can have 4 before the cost increases. Now, really, what makes them better than some of the units that they are similar to, including stuff like the Runic Swiftblades, is the fact that they have a pretty decent attack score, base attack score, for a sword and shield unit. 19 is not half bad. It's better than a lot of units on this list. It's not armor piercing, which, you know, is a pretty significant factor, but there's also the fact that they are important to Harad as a whole. Harad in general have a bit of a tendency within their units to be overly focused on attack, and this comes at the detriment to their defence. Even the slightly scary trollmen have a bit of a lacking nature in their defence for their price point and what they are all about, whereas the Serpent Guard here are certainly the centre of a Harad infantry army, and they do this job very, very well. As the Dead Marshes replay I did demonstrated, against low tier units they will get a lot of kills and they will get a lot of work done. What lets them down slightly is the fact that they don't have excellent armour. Like a lot of units on this list, that carries units pretty high, simply because it means they can hold out for longer, which is what the purpose of a lot of these units are. And the fact that you can only have 4 before the cost increases is a little bit of a downer as well. You know, some units on this list can have 6 or 5, which is slightly better, and that is an important factor. And also 700 florins per unit. It's quite a lot, considering I would say there are some units which are better and cheaper on this list, but nonetheless they do form the bedrock of Harad's infantry, and that can't be overstated, because Harad's infantry is very damaging, but this Serpent Guard unit provides the solidarity that it needs to not get broken too easily. Now we shall move on to number 9. Since vanilla, the Loke Flag Rim and the Serpent Guard seem to have been somewhat bound together on these lists, and so it still seems to be, at least in my opinion, which is odd really, considering they're two quite different units at their core. Now the stats for the Loke Flag Rim are 17 attack, 31 defense and 9 charge. They can form shield wall, they are good versus armour, excellent morale, armour and stamina, 122 men in the unit under normal circumstances, 750 florins each, and 4 before a cost increase. Now the most significant factor here is the good versus armour trait. Most units that are good versus armour, at least most units you will have a lot of on the field, will be two-hander infantry, stuff that is quite vulnerable if targeted by the right skirmish units, or even just in terms of general survivability, they won't hold up to attrition-based warfare as well. On the other hand, the Loke Flag Rim hold up much better in these respects than most other units, which means they are quite effective all around. Rune in general have got a very strong AP core, I find, in terms of their infantry units. However, there are a few letdowns, because with these factors in mind, the Loke Flag Rim could have been an awful lot higher, like several other units on this list, which surprised me, got a lot higher based on a few factors. But when I was testing them, the Loke Flag Rim did lack a little something, and I think that the majority of that comes from the lacking amount of men in the unit. They only have 122 on large scaling, and of course if you bump that up to huge, the gap in terms of effectiveness becomes even bigger between them and the units with slightly more in them. Now the Flag Rim also have the problem of being rather expensive. 750 florins is as expensive as any other unit on this list. That's a pretty significant factor, because if you're going to build an army around a unit, you need it to be relatively cheap. Now with Rune, I will say that they won't mind spending this much money on a mainline unit, mainly because they save a little bit at their highest end. They don't have the ultra high tier selection that, for instance, the dwarves do, where they would need to save their money. However, something else did occur to me, which is the Loke Flag Rim are not as important to Rune as the Serpent Guard are to Harad. They are better in my opinion, but they're not as important. For example, if you wanted to build a main line with Harad, the Serpent Guard are really your only choice that are super effective outside of the pikes. Whereas with Rune you do have the Swift Blades, and while the Swift Blades are not as good as the units on this list in my opinion, they're still pretty good. You can have 6 before the cost increases, but their overall effectiveness is somewhat lacking and a little bit lackluster in my opinion, based on what they offer you. It is still another option, which means Rune have more than one choice at this level. And that means that the Flag Rim's importance is diminished somewhat, but that doesn't make them any less good in my opinion. But, you know, the AP is really what makes them a very, very dangerous threat to some of the high armour factions in particular. Now we shall move on to number 8. So at number 8 we have the heavily armoured central core of Arnor in the Arthedain Men-at-Arms. They have 16 attack, 33 defense and 15 charge. They can form shield wall, they can hide in the woods, excellent morale, armor and stamina, 138 men in the unit on large scaling under normal circumstances, 600 florins each, 6 before the unit cost increases. This is a unit I honestly expected to be a little bit higher perhaps, mainly because you see them so often, but then I got to thinking that that's not really surprising considering the fact that they do form the basis of Arnor's army. Again, they have the same problem as the Loke Flag Rim in one area, in that they have less men in the unit than a lot of their contemporaries, particularly the other human heavy infantry units, which we'll be getting onto shortly. They lack a little bit in terms of numbers, and that can be all important when you're trying to hold the line. I've talked about the cliff that units tend to fall off when they've taken a certain amount of casualties quite a lot, and anything you can do to sort of keep that as far away from you as possible by having more men in the unit is a good thing. Having said that, the Arthedain men-at-arms individually are still a very good unit. They're not AP, which does make them lose out to the Flag Rim in a one-on-one fight. However, they are significantly cheaper, 150 florins each cheaper, and you can have 6 before the unit cost increases, so they are a very, very viable core to your army as Arnor. You could use the Peacekeepers, which are a spear variety, but again, you know, it's designed for different things, and I would argue that this unit is a very, very effective unit at what it does. So I will say that there are other human units which we'll get onto very shortly which are slightly better, mainly because of the amount of men in the unit. That is very important when it comes to building your core. You want more men, and it does come down to fielding as many soldiers as you can, so yeah. But even so, a sword and shield, high survivability, it's what Arnor are very good at. Admittedly, it's what they're good at slightly better when it comes to the very high tier infantry and backing them up with archers, but nonetheless it is still a very effective front line. Backing them up with some standard Arnor pikemen is something which is pretty damn difficult to break down. Now we shall move on to the next position. It's no surprise to see a unit so similar to the Arthedain men-at-arms be right next to them on the list. We have the Dol Amroth men-at-arms. Their stats are very similar at 14 attack, 33 defense, I believe, or was that 35? I cannot read my own writing. I think that's 35 actually. How unprofessional of me. Anyway, they also have 15 charge, they can form shield wall, excellent morale and armour, good stamina, 147 men in the unit under normal circumstances on large scaling, 550 florins each and 6 before the cost increases. Now, all that I said about the Arthedain men-at-arms applies to these guys as well, only backing them up with Edhelond halberdiers is in my opinion even better, because they add a armour piercing touch to the to the survivability that the Dol Amroth men-at-arms provide. But there's 2 significant factors in my opinion which make the Dol Amroth men-at-arms better. One is of course they have more men in the unit. It's only slightly more, it's only 9 more on large scaling, but that is still significant enough in my opinion. But also something else is they're cheaper, 50 florins each cheaper, and Dol Amroth can make more well, it's very important for Dol Amroth to bring some of their high tier units, so any florin you can save is good for buying a unit of Haven Guard or Talon Knights or a unit of cavalry, for example. So that cheapness does help them. The one area where they do fall down slightly is the fact they only have good stamina as opposed to excellent, but in my opinion the cheaper price and the more men in the unit does outset that, especially on huge scaling where it becomes a little bit more potent, the difference in men. But yes, I would say that they are a very solid unit. You're always going to be seeing them if you're up against Dol Amroth, I think, because you know, Dol Amroth does need a more bread and butter unit to go with their higher tier units. Now, Dol Amroth are the most elven of the human factions, I believe, in the sense they do rely on their high tier maybe a little too much. But this is probably the one exception to that rule. It's a solid mid-tier unit. 550 florins is certainly not unreasonable. It's a very good price point in my opinion for what you're getting. Against lower tier units they will easily win, higher tier units they won't, but they will at least hold the line for a decent amount of time. Now we shall move on to number 6, and I'm sure you've guessed which is next. The 3 very similar units are all next to one another. If there was a unit that you could point at that signified the mainline sword and shield unit more than any other, you would probably point at the Gondor Infantry. There's nothing overly flashy about them. They're a case of, we'll get the job done. In our weight class anyway, let's say. They won't do it against the higher tier units, but nonetheless they are the most basic infantry unit you could ever hope to meet, but that's not a bad thing in this case. Their stats are as follows: 11 attack, 32 defense and 15 charge. They can form shield wall, excellent morale, armor and stamina, 153 men in the unit under normal circumstances on large unit scaling, 550 florins each and 6 before the cost increases. Now, what really sets them apart is the fact they have a few more men, very small amount of men more than the Dol Amroth men-at-arms, and they have excellent stamina. They do have slightly worse stats, but in my opinion it doesn't really matter, because there is also the fact that I feel like the Gondor standard units like this are really important to Gondor, more so than with Dol Amroth anyway, because Dol Amroth have got the cavalry, so have Arnor, Gondor, on the other hand, a little bit more about their infantry, so they do rely on units like this a little bit more to hold the line, and that's what makes the Gondor infantry so important to Gondor. I will say that perhaps there is a case you could suggest that their defence is a little lower than it perhaps could be, considering Gondor are meant to be the most dwarven of the human factions. But nonetheless, the fact they have low attack is not really too surprising. A lot of these units have got pretty low attack, all things considered, but they will still hold the line for you. And as I said, the importance to Gondor overall can't be overstated. Them and the Spearmen, of course, it's very similar to the Arnorian Peacekeepers and the Arthedain Men-at-Arms. The Gondorian units individually are worse than those Arnorians, but as a unit, in terms of cost effectiveness and in terms of their importance to the faction, I do feel as though the Gondorians deserve a higher spot. And also, like I said, they really are the embodiment of this category in a nutshell. Now though, we shall move on to the midway point on the list, and number 5. This is a unit I'm still not sure about, to be honest with you, mainly because I don't know if it has a place in this category or not, but then that's the nature of elven units, I suppose. We have the Silvan Axemen of the Elves of Lothlorien. Their stats are as follows: 22 attack, 44 defense and 7 charge. They can form shield wall, good versus armor, excellent morale and stamina, good armor, 650 florins each, 106 men in the unit under normal circumstances on large scaling, and they have 4 before the cost increases. Now obviously in terms of the volume you can deploy, both in terms of men in the unit and in terms of the amount of them you can field before the increase in cost, all 3 of the human units I mentioned before are better than the Silvan Axemen. What really pushes them this high, in my opinion, is just how good they are in terms of their stats. 22 attack and 44 defense is a pretty serious unit. You're not going to be able to break through these guys if they're entrenched with any old garbage. And there is also the fact that they're AP, which doesn't hurt at all. It means that they will be able to deal with slightly heavily armoured aggression a little bit better than the 3 human units previously. Only, while the Loke Flag Rim have got stats which are comparable or worse than the 3 human units we saw previously, the Silvan Axemen's stats are significantly better. This does come at the cost of having even less men in the unit, of course. 106 is very low, so, you know, they will hit the cliff more quickly, but this is an elven problem in general. But then the elves can always back up their units with archers more easily than most factions, so perhaps it doesn't apply too much. Now they do have the other option, of course, of the Sylvan Silver Spears, so they're not absolutely mandatory like the likes of the Serpent Guard are for Harad, but even so, I do think that the dedicated mid-tier that Lothlorien have is a real boon. I will say that I don't think they're as strong as the Woodland Realms or the High Elves still, but even so, this mid-tier does make them a little bit more agreeable in some ways than the other 2 elven factions. The big reason why they didn't get any higher on the list, because there are several units ahead of them which they could beat in a 1v1 in terms of their units, is because their mass. Elven mass has always been a bit of a problem. They are easy to force their way through, and this is the problem. Elves traditionally find themselves on the defensive, and getting forced through is a pretty common tactic, and it's effective, particularly against the elves, because the elves pretty much rely on being able to bottle up the enemy and kill them with their superior skill, but if you can smash through their formation, that's a problem. It is a problem that the elves suffer with in general, and the Silvan Axemen are no exception to that. Now, it is something which their dwarven brethren managed to get over in spades, but unfortunately the elves will always be plagued by this, I imagine, and so in this category I think that they are quite fortunate to find themselves so high up, considering it's an area they don't traditionally do very well in. It's usually the very high tier where they focus their efforts. Nonetheless, we shall move on to number 4. In a similar vein to the Gondor Infantry, when you think of Lord of the Rings armies marching with sword and shield in hand, the Uruk-Hai Infantry are one of the first things you think of, and naturally I think they are quite a good unit indeed. They do have some downsides, but first of all let's talk about the good things. They have 18 attack, 37 defense and 10 charge. They can form shield wall, excellent morale, armor and stamina, 168 men in the unit under normal circumstances on large scaling, and I've lost what they... here we are. 750 florins each, and you can have 4 before the cost increases. Now there are a few good things and a few bad things to talk about there, but they all balance out into a pretty darn good unit for its price in my opinion. The first thing is the stats, pretty high defense, pretty high attack as well, to be honest with you, and this all comes with a unit size which is not as big as several of the other orcs, but still larger than most of the units of men, and that is, you know, as I've said before, having just a few more men in the unit makes that unit cliff that they fall off just that little bit further away. Now most orcs will often find themselves on the attack, but the Uruk-Hai Infantry are a very good all-purpose unit simply because they are tough, resilient, and also the fact that, you know, they can absorb a little bit more punishment than most others. Like, for example, the Uruk-Hai Raiders, not really particularly good at dealing with arrow fire, not so with the Uruk-Hai Infantry, much better at dealing with it, obviously discounting very high tier stuff. Let's talk about some of the downsides. First of all, they are the joint most expensive unit on this list with the Loke Flag Rim at 750 florins each. It's a significant investment. Now, Isengard don't have much super high tier to spend the money on. You're obviously going to have your Nazkai, perhaps your Champions of the White Hand and your Trolls of the White Hand, but past that, you're not really going to be spending your money on anything too expensive. So you could argue that Isengard are pretty well placed to spend their money on this unit, similar to the Loke Flag Rim of Rune, really. They also only have 4 before the cost increases. Now that can be an issue, but ultimately I think that at 750 each, you're likely to only have that amount anyway. So, you know, it's kind of a difficult situation, really. I would say that they're kind of like the units of men we saw before, only with better stats and with more men in the unit. And this is what, in my opinion, pushes them above the Silvan Axemen, because the Silvan Axemen, of course, not very men in the unit, a little bit more vulnerable to attrition-based warfare, particularly with the fact that they don't have excellent armour, which they do manage to sort of get around by being so good. But in this case, I do think that the Uruk-Hai are such an integral part of Isengard, and they're pretty darn effective that they do warrant the 4th spot. However, they're not the highest evil unit, and they're not even the highest orc unit, as we will find at number 3. All of Mordor's Morannon units form a dedicated mid-tier for Mordor, which is probably the most cost-effective in the game as it stands. It's got especially the archers, it must be said, and the two-hander axe Morannon unit. Those two units can pay for themselves very, very easily. But even when it comes to the sword and shield units, it's an area in which Mordor technically shouldn't be very good. They should be all about their very low-tier trash and their very, very high-tier sort of special units like their Balrogs. But as it stands, the Morannon units give them a very, very good mid-tier as well. You can see the Orcish sword model from Skyrim there, I can recognise that. But as far as stats goes, they have 14 attack, 28 defense and 10 charge. They have excellent morale and stamina and good armour. They cost 600 each, and you can have 5 before the cost increases. Now on the face of it, there's nothing particularly amazing there, and I'm inclined to agree, but there's something about the Morannon units which makes them just so efficient, I suppose is the word. They seem to be very good at doing what they do for their cost. I mean, 600 is not an overt amount of money, and yet they still manage to do very, very well for their cost. And while I would say that the Morannon units are not as good in their class, well, at least the Morannon standard Uruks are not as good in their class as, say, the two-hander axe unit or the archers are, they're still 3rd in my opinion, which for a Mordor unit is not really a category you would expect them to do well in terms of just vomiting numbers out onto the field, yes, but that does remind me as well that their advantage will grow a little bit when you're on huge unit scaling, maybe on large unit scaling a little bit less so. You know, they may well find themselves losing out to the Uruk-Hai Infantry on large unit scaling because it is very close between them, but I would still be inclined to give it to the Mordor army because casualties are something that they can accept a little bit more easily than Isengard can these days. So yes, the Morannon Uruks, I'm really not sure what to make of them, mainly because I know that there are hidden stats which, you know, hidden stats are something which I'm not too eager to go into in great detail until the full version is out, because again, everything is subject to change. You know, those sorts of things are a little bit more experimental, stuff like arrow weight. You know, not very many mods in the past have fiddled around with that sort of thing, but the Morannon Uruks, suffice it to say, are a very, very efficient type of unit across all of their categories, not just the sword and shield variant. But now we'll move on to perhaps an equally surprising entrant at number 2. If you'd have told me beforehand that a Candish unit would be contending for one of the best mainline units in the game, I would have looked at you with a very puzzled expression. But nonetheless, the Nurad Footmen have impressed me to an extent that I would say they are number 2 on this list, and that's for a couple of reasons. Not just because they're pretty good. They have 19 attack, 40 defense and 9 charge, shield wall of course, good versus armor and in deserts, excellent morale and armor, good stamina, 152 men in the unit under normal circumstances on large scaling, 700 florins each and 4 before the cost increases. Now there are several things to note there. One, is the good versus armour stat. This is something which got the Silvan Axemen and Loke Flag Rim onto the list. Unlike those two, however, they maintain the amount of men in the unit of the standard human kingdoms, which is very significant, and they don't lose out in terms of stats either. Because in terms of stats, they are overall just straight up better than the Flag Rim, and for 50 florins less. Now they are still 700 each, so you know, it is still not exactly the cheapest unit on this list, but Khand don't have the high tier stuff, at least in terms of their infantry, that they're going to spend it on elsewise. And that brings me to the most significant part of the Nurad Footmen, and that is they are the only Khandish infantry that you can buy in bulk, which will do a very good job. A lot of the other Khandish infantry has a very bad habit of breaking very quickly. They're not particularly good in terms of stats. Really, that morale problem is the main concern, though. Khand are traditionally all about their cavalry, and rightly so, but you can't build a main line out of Brotherhood of the Sword and Axe, which are two good units. You can, however, build one out of this, and they are very defensible, they're tough to kill, and if you send an armoured unit against them, they will take pretty heavy casualties. The problem that Khand have is backing them up with sufficient numbers so that they don't get absolutely overwhelmed, but, you know, it's how Khand plays. Their importance to Khand can't be overstated. You need some infantry on the field after all. No one is going to let you take a full cavalry army, because that's just ridiculous. And this is a very good place to invest your money as Khand, because people may get overconfident with their infantry over yours if you're playing as Khand, and, well, this is a unit which can make them regret that, particularly if they're one that's heavily focused on their armour. You could argue that if you're up against a lightly armoured faction like the Woodland Realms, this unit would slide down the list quite a bit because of its good versus armoured nature, but even so, I would say that for surprise factor alone, this unit deserves a special mention. But having said that, the unit that's at number 1, not particularly surprising at all, really. And of course, at number 1, in their usual spot when it comes to infantry-related matters, we find the Dwarves and their Ironfoot warriors. Their stats are 24 attack, 43 defense, and 12 charge. They can form shield wall, they're good versus armour, excellent morale, stamina and armour. 102 men in the unit under normal circumstances. They're good in the snow. Well, actually no, they're not good in the snow, are they? Well, we'll get on to that though. They have 600 florins is what they cost, and you can have 6 before the cost increases. Now, when most people think of the Dwarves, they think of their super high tier infantry, and rightly so. It's very scary. The Mithril Guard are practically bulletproof. The Sons of Durin will cave your head in with relative impunity. But really, I would argue that one of the major strengths of the Dwarves is the fact that they can field a main line as strong as this, and there's not really a great deal you can do about it. And in terms of stats and numbers, they are very, very similar to the Silvan Axemen. However, they also have the mass and the armour to back this up, and that's pretty significant. And there is also another factor that I would consider quite significant, and that is, I'm sure you've noticed it down at the bottom, these guys, the Khazad warriors. The Khazad warriors are essentially the same unit as, well actually I've got this wrong, haven't I? The amount of unit, the unit numbers I said wrong, but nonetheless, Khazad warriors are essentially the same unit, only they are good in snow and they cost 50 florins more, and well, you can only have 4 before the cost increases. They do have a slightly higher charge bonus as well, but for the purposes of this, they are essentially the same effectiveness in terms of units, which essentially means you can have 10 mainline infantry units without the cost increasing on you at all. All of them are also good versus armour, all of them have got high mass, so you can't force your way through like you can with the elves. It gives the dwarves the strength in depth that really no other faction has, and there is a little bit of redundancy with the dwarves here. I would say it's fine, but you know, with the 2 pike units which are virtually identical, it might be a bit overkill. But even so, this strength that the dwarves can bring to bear on their front line without it crumbling too easily is something that you can't really overlook. Especially with the Ironfoot warriors, it must be said. I think that the axes that these guys bring, and just the 6 before the cost increases for a unit this good, it really is something which many factions can't really live with, particularly the ones that rely on armour themselves, like Dale and Gondor, for example. But yes, the dwarves, up to their usual tricks when it comes to infantry, in my opinion. This is the one unit that I'm pretty darn confident in terms of its position. Everything else, I would say, is subject to a little bit of personal interpretation, particularly when it comes to certain units, like the Silvan Axemen. Should they be on the list? You know, the Loke Flag Rim, should they be on the list? Should it be the Swift Blades instead? That sort of thing. And I would be very curious to see what you all think, to be honest with you, because there was more of my personal opinion in this than any other. As I say, the qualifier for this was, can you build an army around it? because, you know, if I was just taking in terms of the middle of their power, well, the middle of the faction's power level, stuff like the Mithlond Nobles would have to be considered. Again, the Woodland Realms would have to be considered as well, stuff like that. You know, and I think that doesn't really work, because it doesn't really fit into the spirit of having a line of men, having a bit more of an overall look this time, because of course I am thinking about how the units fit into the factions now as well, and the Ironfoot warriors complement their faction perfectly as well as that. So this was the mid-tier, and I'm interested to see what you think about this, particularly stuff like the Nurad Footmen. But yeah, as for what's coming next, I hope to do a few more replays. I hope that my recordings can be in slightly higher quality than they used to be with my new editing software. It's probably not going to be huge, because this is a pretty old game, so the resolution on it is likely going to be a bit of a hampering problem, but still, that's not really a big deal. Like, on high quality it looks pretty good, to be honest with you, for a over 10-year-old game. But yeah, I hope to do a few more replays, maybe a few more top 10s, I don't know. I'm not sure what the timetable is for new factions and such, because I am waiting for them until I can do my faction overviews, which I am kind of eager to do, because now the factions are more distinct. Either way, I'm now back making things again after the scare I had with my PC, and I hope to see you for whatever I do next.